Good morning, Dr. Michael Fisher here. I am very interested this morning in, first of all, informing you that my book's working and coming along slowly, but it's going to be out early spring and late spring, probably published, but my first draft will be out. And it's called The Marianne Williamson Presidential Phenomenon. And it's really my documentation. Subtitle will be something probably like, what's my latest one? Cultural Revolution in a Dangerous Time. Cultural revolution is something that a lot of people have asked me about my fear management work, which it's really easy to sort of put me in a box and my work in a box and say, oh, that's all about fear management. That's what you do. And I like to sort of say, well, fear management in what kind of level are we talking about here? The micro fear management of an individual and how they balance their life, manage their life, and fear being a really important part of that. And then there's the much larger picture, kind of a philosophical picture and a political picture, a sociological picture of managing fear at the level of a whole entire society and the world. But particularly, I'm interested in probably in many ways, my work and my thinking, even though I have a very strong psycho-spiritual awareness and education background professionally as well as an academic, I'm more and more convinced that we have to look at the cultural and the political. Just let me shut my heater off. The cultural and the political levels, the sociological levels, the economic levels, the levels that are not so simple about just what's going on in my body, my feelings, my body, mind, soul, spirit, right? What we sometimes call holistic. So I talk about we need an integral perspective. And I'm not the only one doing that. There's a whole theory and body of work called integral philosophy, integral theory. And just to keep in mind, integral philosophy and theory is used by different people in different ways. So you have to kind of sort through that, what you're interested in. But I'm particularly interested in a stream of integral thinkers, not just integrative thinkers, but integral thinkers, and how then to bring that integral philosophy and theory. So Ken Wilber is one of the contemporary spokespersons for the integral philosophy and theory. He's not the only one, and he's not necessarily the best overall in history. There's been different kinds of integral thinkers. And again, it's another word for holistic. It's another concept for integrative or complementary, but it's really very beyond integrative and holistic, and it's much more critical and I think much more thorough than any other kind of philosophy I've ever seen. And I've looked around. I've looked at a lot for probably 40 years or more of my exploring and reading and thinking, and also practicing how to bring good practices onto the planet that will move us away from a fear-based structure, right? The fear matrix, as I call it, that seems to have a grip on us all. So that's just a quick intro. I'm throwing out a lot of things there, but I want to kind of get down to some real basics of what a concern is that I've seen within both fear management discourses and some of the people that read my work and think about my work. I just want to kind of put out a cautionary in your own thinking and imaginary around how you make sense of, right, and how you interpret my work on all the work that I have, which is, is a vast amount of work, and it's not always totally consistent, and it also has its own evolution within my work. So the moment you pick up something and you think, oh, now I've read this, I can understand what Dr. Fisher is saying about fear and fearlessness, fear management education, as I often call it, then I always say, well, be very cautious of that, because any good long-term philosopher thinker changes their views over time. And Ken Wilber, his integral philosophy from when he started in the early 70s, all the way up till he still writes and teaches today, there's definitely threads of universality, just like with my work, but there's also shifts, and some significant shifts and evolutions. So one has to really be careful to not overgeneralize too quickly on what any thinker, writer, teacher is saying, and put it in perspective of their body of work. So that aside, let's go into my more specific, concrete concerns with the issues around, let's just call it fear management, fear education. And I often call it just fear management education, because management is always an educational process. You see that? So that's my educator. I'm trained to have a PhD in education curriculum. So I'm always thinking about whether it's therapy or whether it's management and business or organization, or just management in the largest sense of emotional management or fear management. I'm always thinking of the educational process of that management or that therapy, right? That even that clinical practice that might be going on in the field of healthcare, psychiatry, and so on, medicine. I'm always interested in what's the educational process that's actually going on. And that educational process can be very informal, right? It can actually just be when a person, let's just say a doctor, meets with a patient, or a nurse with a patient, or any kind of caregiver in that therapeutic sense, when they meet and they discuss the case, the problem that the client has brought to them, their patient, etc. There's a huge educational process going on there that is very intriguing to me, and I'm always looking in that direction. So that's where I will look at more the educational. How is fear being taught? How is our knowledge about fear being constructed? And what is the historical genealogy, right? The sort of roots of the formation of a particular discourse that people start participating in any kind of exchange and relationship, in their own study of their own understanding of themselves and their relationship to fear, their fearological relations. We need a critical literacy, so I often talk about that. And that's a little bit what I'm talking about today, but let me just focus in again on very specifically what this video is about. I've seen a lot of people, because in the 1970s, the late 70s particularly, I myself got quite involved in, let's just call it the human potential movement, the self-help and the self-therapy movement, and doing a lot of holistic practices, spiritual practices, to bring myself to a better balance. So I'm just going to read a quote here from Marianne Williamson. She wrote a foreword to a book called Living in Gratitude by Angelis Arian back in 2011. But just this one quote, just to get us into a certain language that may be more familiar with you as a listener. So she says, we know we're off balance now and then, sometimes a lot. Yet we often struggle to realign ourselves. Rarely do we realize that if we simply take time to marvel at life's gifts and give thanks for them, we activate stunning opportunities and creativity, obviously, that can come from that. So this notion of realign, it is a language that we will use, other people use when we're off center. We used to talk a lot about this in the 80s. I feel off center, or how do I get back on my center? How do I get back in a sense of balance and harmony, which the indigenous peoples forever have had a long experience and wisdom about how to bring both individuals and the group and the culture itself back into certain harmonies. With nature is a really big one for culture, because culture tends to want to take off with its ideas and its ways and habits and traditions and rituals. But if those are not connected to the natural world, and for humans, it's getting back in touch with your body, from your mind to your heart, back into your basic body and senses. All of those are these realignment processes. And again, there's many kinds of therapies you can practice: meditation, yoga, and on and on. But what I've noticed, here's my point of the video, and then I'll get to what integral and integrative uh, are and how I think we need to be aware of those, particularly as apply this video to fear management education. What I notice is that people become so on this path, right? On this path of awareness, call it an enlightenment path, call it path of fearlessness, whatever. Holistic health and well-being, all of that, when you're attracted to that, which is this larger and larger body of people, not everybody, it's still not the majority that are aware and so carefully interested and practicing with some discipline along that path. But those who are, this is what I've noticed over almost 45 years, I guess, of really watching, participating in my own different ways in and out of these movements, wholeness, wellness, etc., is that people will take on all these practices. They're always looking for the next fix, the next way to realign themselves, right? To find their center, to feel whole again. And again, I'm not putting that down as a motivation or interest. It's obviously, I think, both instinctual, and it's also just really good intelligence from learning that when you get off balance, you get yourself into trouble, you get yourself into illnesses. It's not the only cause of illness. It's not the only cause of getting into trouble psychologically or just physically in your life, etc. But that those places of off balance or like distress, we often will call it, start to become toxic, and you know that you need to detoxify. You, whatever the practices that you're doing, your habits, etc., you have to bring those back, right? To detoxify those, to create a healthier set of relations with the world, including your interior life and the life of the exteriors. People in those movements, and this has been a large mass, I see it over and over again over all these decades. And I've watched myself, go along with this problem of basically consuming and grabbing products and services to fix, help you realign, and techniques, right? So what I've noticed is that, people at my age, I'm just going to speak to right now, and so it's not as applicable to younger people still exploring, and I don't hang around younger people so much. But the older people who have been on this path, or as I say, of wellness for a long time, they really are not very integrative. Okay, what does that mean by that? Well, what they sort of do is they go and try this practice, right? Holistic this, or yoga this, or meditation, mindfulness, eating properly, doing this diet and special, doing a spirituality practice of whatever kind, and so on, going on retreats, practicing silence, gratitude. There's such a huge menu that's been made available. And of course, remember, there's a lot of money and economics behind that, billions of dollar industry in the self-help wellness, and not just that, but even going to see practitioners in the medical field or integrative medicine and so on, counselors, therapists. Not very integrative. They're basically collecting and trying different things. That's sort of a real pragmatic, right? It's like test the world, try something. It's a little bit of an experiment, and then see what happens, right? See how it improves. What I find is most people, when they practice and go after something new, typically they don't stay with it very long, especially if they don't feel they're getting positive results, or they just don't stay with it very long because they found something else that's more interesting the next day, or the next week, or the next month. And isn't that interesting? That's so cool. And it's really an addiction, in my humble opinion, underneath all that, to keep grabbing, searching for the right practice, the right thing, the right medicine, right, in a sense. the right practitioners that are going to save you, help you, liberate, be healthy, whatever your goals might be and all that. But it's a very kind of self-driven and often very self-obsessed. And my concern is it's not integrative. So integrative has to begin to look at larger spheres of life. This is the difference between, just trying to get what's going to make you feel better. And maybe those around you, you might be doing this with your family, trying to create all these things too, if you're a parent or a caregiver or whatever. But if you're not thinking about an integrative theory or framework, so I'm going to start with integrative, then I'm going to move to integral, as I said. So integrative, or sometimes called holistic, is where you want to look at, the body, you want to look at the emotions, you want to look at the mind, you want to look at the spirit or the soul and all these dimensions. So a lot of people will look and check and, go into consuming and those different domains of knowledge, wisdom that are being passed on, and practices with them in each of those different domains I just named. And then, sometimes they will look at knowledge from different disciplines. So in a philosophical way, we would be practicing wellness by looking at anthropology, what sociology has to offer, what psychology has to offer, what theology has to offer, and on and on. And even understanding things like economics and political theory is also part of an integrative approach to understanding the world and your relationship to it, which means you have to understand yourself and potentially understand it from the broadest, right, full spectrum, multiple perspectives. So that's usually what integrative or holistic is pretty much defined within, and that's pretty much where it stops. So to get to the point as I finish this video, integrative is an improvement upon sort of this eclectic accumulation that I talked about of approach. Integrative is much better, brings in that diversity, multiple perspectives, viewpoints, directions. But then we have to move to integral. And I won't try to make this video about a description and a full understanding of integral philosophy, integral theory, the integral framework or models, and certainly not trying to define that. It's a much longer conversation. It's in a lot of my writing. I've called myself a critical integral theorist of fear and fearlessness. So integral shifts to a perspective where it goes, okay, integrative's good. It's better than, just the collecting, accumulative, eclectic approach. Integrative's a little more paying attention to some kind of balancing of multiples. But integral then says, but there's no ability within integrative framework itself, integrative theories and ideas, the imaginary of integrative that we carry, there's no real sense of how to actually challenge the different perspectives or arrange those different perspectives in a meaningful way, even a sort of natural hierarchical or evaluated way, so that you can start to get a sense, well, right now that's probably better to look at that direction or do this practice than that one. And you actually are thinking through using an integral framework, which you have to really kind of get back and have a witness on all of the diversity and all the many, because you're really working at trying to see their arrangement integrally. I know that's a little bit vague at some level, but if you can just think about it, it's kind of moving to a more critical overview, what some people call a meta perspective, which is a perspective of perspectives. And then being able to actually work and think about how to bring those into a better set of relations, and a set of relations that show differences and that, challenge and are critical of some of those approaches, the diversity. So it's not just all the same, and the more all is the better, the more many. integral says, oh, no, they have a different place. And so that's where integral theory, at least the ones that I tend to be attracted to, Ken Wilber's especially, is an evolutionary theory that looks at levels of complexity, levels of arrangements of relations. And as I said, it's a discernment. It's much more discerning than integrative. So again, my concern is that most people are not integrative in choosing all these practices for their making themselves better or even making the world better. There's still a lot of flailing around in a way. People not having a framework. It's not their fault. They just don't have a framework for actually how that all that knowledge that you're taking in, even wisdom and so on, and healing and whatever is going on, how to put it into frameworks of making sense of reality, your development, the development of the world, and as I say, the development of culture itself. And so integral has this critical discerning process. And I find people who want to be in just integrative and holistic, or even, as I say, those people who are perhaps a lot more scattered and just consuming, they're not even at integrative thinking yet, discernment, that they really want to avoid conflict, and they want to avoid the conflict that goes with critique of, and the sorting of, and the classification of, the ordering and the discernment that comes from an integral perspective. The vision logic is the term, the cognitive term, or a perspectival vision logic. Various theorists have used for integral thinking, integral philosophy framework applied to the diversity. And yes, it's going to have a lot more critique and conflict in it, and it requires a much more discerning mind of organizing and classifying. And I find most people do not want to deal with that. They don't want that complexity. They don't like the conflict period. They don't want to do critique. They just want everybody to be integrative, or just want things to be integrative, meaning it'll all work out, or we're all the same, we're all equal. It's sort of the flat pluralism ideology behind it, where everything's equal, we're all equal, everything's fundamentally good, as at least we can make it good. And we won't go into that anymore. I think you get the gist of what I'm getting to, is that fear management, when it moves from just collecting all kinds of things from books on fear management, and there's articles, there's hundreds, thousands of people informing and teaching about how to manage fear, what fear is, how to manage it. And then when you get to integrative, then it's a little more systematic, because you're, as I say, pulling from the different disciplines, you're pulling from the different realms, right? From physiology to spirituality, science, religion, and so on, arts, bringing in, multiple perspectives. That's good. But it's, again, that for fear management still is only integrative. It's not yet or holistic, and it's not yet got this critical integral meta perspective on all those perspectives. So that's where my work sits. That's what I promote for people who are going into the field of fear management, fearlessness, interested in how love is related to all of that, etc. We're not just talking about a simple emotion of fear here. You can see it's just way more complex, because it's got to do with our human relationship to fear and how we construct fear, and are those constructions actually useful and valuable? In other words, the knowledge constructions that we get from history, those discourses I talked about. Well, that's how they did it in the past. That's what they wrote about. That's what this philosopher said, and so on. When you move to integral, you really free yourself. It's also very challenging, because it's like, oh my gosh, it feels overwhelming to look at that perspective, meta perspective, but all of that, how am I going to make sense? How am I going to organize it? How am I going to critique it? All those other knowledges, right? Why? Because integral is always wanting to pursue the creative, in some sense, an edge of what's the next evolutionary advance in thought, in framework, in philosophy, in theory, and practices that really go with it, real practices for the real world. It's always moving at that creative edge and not settling for. It's not like it destroys or wants to or delete the past and all the discourses that have come, the accumulating intelligence about fear, what I call defense intelligence fundamentally. Fear is always about that in some way. But Integral says, let's include the best of those perspectives, histories of knowledge about fear management, education, but let's not let them also control the inquiry. Let's not let that past control what we're capable of and what we may even need as breakthrough knowledges and investments and commitments to those breakthroughs to actually perhaps create new knowledge that's, again, it's shouldered. Anything new has always got the past. It's always built on respect for what came before, but not be controlled by what has become. And that's the way it is. And that's the way we should be, because that's the norm and that's the status quo. And that's the way it's been done before. You can see always moving forward. So integrative starts to mess up, right? The simple kind of knowledge or practices or ways of framing the fear problem and your fears and dealing with them and so on. But integrative starts, and then integral really jumps to this meta perspective of critique and challenge. So that's where my work comes in. And if you want to study fearology, example, or fear analysis or feariatry, different terms, we have a huge vocabulary. When I say we, there's a whole group of philosophy of fearism people slowly starting to emerge on the planet. Desh Suba is one of the founders of that movement, and in my work, more paradigm of fearlessness or philosophy, fearlessness philosophy is all. And then there's others who have been writing about philosophy of fear, and etc. And everyone is starting to have some conversations, but we still haven't had this conversation of what is the difference between this eclectic kind of reach consume model, which I call very pragmatic, right? You say, well, what's working now? And okay, well, that didn't work, so I'm going to try this. And then how to get to integrative. So I'm not seeing a lot of even good integrative models, thinking practices yet, and people who actually are integrated themselves across that diversity of perspectives at integrative. I'm not seeing that a lot. It's pretty rare. And so I don't even think we barely got to that level in terms of fear management education. And then to get to critical integral is just a much more challenging, and it's also much more, in a quote, dangerous really too, because integral really challenges the status quo, the past, the traditions, and often the traditions and the past and the status quo do not want to be challenged because they have domination. They have the hegemonic control of the way of knowing and the right way. And that's where the movement of fearism or fearlessness, philosophy of fear, the advancement of evolution of that philosophy, those philosophies requires a lot of courage. It requires itself fearlessness, and that's why fearlessness is so important to me as a real practice of how to do inquiry, of how to do research, of how to think and write and teach, and obviously share with the world. So I'm not saying I'm an expert at doing that at all. It's been an amazing, long learning journey and continues. Thanks very much for listening to this. Look forward to your comments. Share them on the YouTube link below. Okay, bye now.